Good evening, Demon fans, and welcome back to the Demonland podcast universe. My name is Andy, and in just a moment, our very own Binman will take you through his full-length stats files, breaking down all the stats from Melbourne's disappointing loss to the Dockers in Perth. If you haven't yet listened to the main podcast, make sure you do that afterwards or before. It should be the show preceding this one in your feed. And if you're a fan of Binman's stats files, you can really help the show by leaving us a 5-star review and a comment on Apple Podcasts. Better still, mention Binman's stats files in your review, and I'll read it out on next week's show right here on this podcast. So without further ado, here's Binman with the stats files.
Big hello to my fellow Demon fanatics. Welcome to week 2, the second edition of the inaugural Stats File podcast, Demonland offshoot, round 2, D's versus Dockers. Just a bit of housekeeping. This is really the first week. Last week is going to be considered my official opening round or pre-season for the standalone Demonland Stats File pod. Listening back in the spirit of Kaizen, I felt like that the show actually did need a little bit more structure than I gave last week. To be fair to myself, we only decided the previous day that I would be doing a standalone stats file pod. So I thought the idea of a sort of fluid, unstructured show would work. Listen back. It didn't work as well as I would have liked, so I am going to go structure. As I said last week that I would try to bring it under 20. I don't think that's going to happen, to be perfectly frank, but I'm going to aim for 30 minutes. Bang on 30 minutes, give or take 1 or 2 minutes, I guess. So just as I say, a bit of housekeeping. The structure that I'm going to run with this season is introduction. We can consider this introduction. Why we won or lost. So I'm going to not bury the lead and just jump to why I think we either won the game of the game of footy that we just watched, or as in the case on the weekend, lost it. The second standing sort of agenda item for the show is equity points. I'm going to talk about it each week, our equity points, not predominantly, but with not always, but with a focus on our equity points for winning the ball and equity points for how well we used the ball or didn't use the ball. And then I'm going to talk about the 3 phases of football. So structure the analysis of the data in sort of 3 categories or 3 phases of football: defense, offense, and contest. You'll hear that all the time. Coaches talk about the 3 phases of football. I was also going to talk about what's often called the 4th phase, about transition, or it's called the transition phase. And I decided not to because it's a bit confusing, because transition's also discussed as how well the ball's moved from the back half to the front half. So I'm just going to focus on defense, offense, and contest. I'll speak a little bit about those things in a little bit. And then the final thing, a wrap up, but if time, I'll also occasionally do a stats focus preview of next game, if the next game we're playing, if we have time. I won't have time tonight, partly because of this intro. And also through the season, how we're tracking compared to other teams for key stats like time in forward half, for instance, or how we use the ball, or things that demonstrate how we play. So just apologies in advance. I'm not going to do these twice, so I apologise for any of the errors that will come up. It's a bit unusual speaking into a microphone by yourself, so I'm sure I'll make some errors and muddle up my words and whatnot, but I don't have time really to go back and correct them or redo it. So, as I say, apologies in advance. So before, without any further ado, we'll jump into it. So why we won or lost. This is something that sort of exercised my mind for a few seasons, and I would have talked about it on the, if you're a Demonland podcast listener, you would have heard me talk about this. Is I often feel, particularly with data analysis, but not just that, there's often a sort of tendency for fans to confuse what I would call symptoms with the causation or what the underlying cause is. So, why we won or lost this game, people might point to, for instance, our lack of pressure or our inefficiency going forward, or or their defence, or our forwards not leading as much as they did the previous week, or a number of things that we might think, or someone might argue, we might argue that that's the reason why we lost this game. I would contend that a lot of those things are symptoms, and that not the cause. So for example, why did the forwards not lead as often as they did against the Saints? Because there was often just no space in the forward line for our forwards to lead into. Why was there often no space in our forward line? Partly because Freo's defensive unit did a top job with their setup and zone defence, meaning we're often kicking into a congested forward line. Why were they able to do a top job with their setup into zone defence? Well, I think a big factor why was our lack of run and overlap handball after winning, when we won the ball after winning a turnover and moving it from our back half. If you do that well, doing so successfully means the ball moves quickly on transition, as we saw against the Saints. It drags defenders out of their D50 to press up on players receiving the handball. That fast ball movement, which is what we're trying to implement this year under King, creates the opportunity, particularly that forward handball and players pressing up on the player who's about to receive it, creates that opportunity to tic-tac over the opponents and create space inside our 50, because the defenders are dragged out of the 50. That creates space inside our 50 for our forwards to lead into and have lots of genuine one-on-one contests, which is exactly what Freo did to us in the first quarter. The fact that they're able to do that was made easier by the same lack of run that hurt us on offense. That's why they had so much space inside their 50, and why they got so many genuine one-on-one contests exposed us defensively, particularly in that first quarter, as I say. That was a key factor, our lack of spread and run. As I talked about last week on both the main pod and on this pod, very similar game plans that we're trying to implement, King's trying to implement, as Freo have. So, it was great to watch how they played, because that's where we want to get to. Why did we often bomb it long into a crowded forward line, and we also bombed it long around the ground a lot? A big factor in that is because King has made it clear we're a low disposal territory team. That's how he's going to play. He wants us to go forward at all costs by both hand and foot, and there's a clear instruction. If there's not a clear short option to hit up either by hand or by kick, then go for distance, kick for distance, handball for distance. And that's, and as is already, even though it's only 2 games into the season, it's already sort of evident in the data, at least at this early stage, that we will actually be a more long bomb territory focused team than we were under Goody in 25, which, it will take a few people, I think, a while to get their head around that, but it's just the case. I still think people are trapped in this memory of us in 21, 22 and 23 of being a long bomb team. So, there's irony heaped on irony that King is actually taking us back to that to a large degree, which I think is, as I say, is ironic, but it's also interesting. As evidence, I talked about this on the main pod, as evidence of that go forward territory focused game plan. Daniel Hoyne last week, last week after the Saints game, noted that we had the opportunity to switch laterally 27 times against the Saints and only did so twice for the entire game, and that with our kicks, 95% of the time we looked to go directly toward or go forward towards our goal. That's really interesting, and it's different to certainly how the Saints played. They cross switch a lot. It's different to how the Lions are playing, for instance, who use a lot of short hit-up kicks to control the ball until they can get someone free and open, and then they go fast, but they also go lateral a lot more than us. Yeah, why were there no, as I said, so I think these fans should get used to us being a long bomb team. That's what we want to do. We won't go lateral, and we won't use short up lead, up kicks in the way the Lions do, as I said, and I think Pies and a number of other teams are doing that too. They look to move the ball forward, as I say, with control and precision, and when they want to go fast, then they go fast. So why were there often no clear short options? We could spot up by hand and foot to set up wave running and overlap, because we lacked run. And so for me, the key cause of our loss was simple, is that we lacked run. We really weren't spreading. We weren't covering the ground. Why did we lack run? I think that's a really good question. It could be that we struggled to come up after a 6-day break. Could be we struggled with the heat, and it was 28 degrees and 85% humidity when the game started after a game last week that was also pretty hot. I think it was 25, 26 degrees. It could well be a few players, as been suggested, on Demonland in a couple of threads and posts, that were impacted by the flu that has been running rampant in Melbourne in the last few weeks. It could be that we were not mentally prepared for their pressure, or we had too many passengers, and in all likelihood it might well be a combination of all of those factors. But whatever the reason for our lack of run and spread, in my view, that was the key reason why we lost against Freo, and a key reason why they opened us up in that first quarter in particular. I thought we were terrific, really, in the last 3 quarters, and I think the data sort of reflects that as well. Terrific in many senses, but obviously we lost the game in the first quarter. They had 25 inside 50s in that first quarter, which is really off the charts. Pretty hard to defend against that, particularly when you're not running and cover. You're not running, putting pressure on their receivers. They also, through the match, had 72 handball receives, which is incredible. I think they had 82 handballs more than us, but 72 handball more receives. So I think that was a massive factor, particularly in that first quarter. So that lack of run, I think, the long kicking, the difficulty defending turnover, the number of open plays they had around the ground and inside their 50, our inefficiency going forward, and conversely their efficiency going forward, were all factors in the loss, but I would argue they were the symptoms, not the cause, and the cause was the lack of run. From a stats perspective, it's really difficult. The problem from a stats perspective around trying to get a handle on how well a team is running or covering the ground is there's really very little publicly available data that gives us an insight into that. The clubs obviously don't want the GPS data that's out there. They know to a centimetre how far players are run. They know how striding pace it's called, so that's they know they're sprinting, so that's running at sort of at pace, like Nibbler was really high striding pace when he was at the D's. Now Sharp is playing a very similar role. They know how many sprints players do. They know all of that. Obviously they've got a good handle on their aerobic capacity and their aerobic fitness, but the data's not out there, understandably. And I've been looking for ages for this, and the only data that I can really find that's of any use is the tracker on the AFL mobile app. That's got some great data, but it's limited. So, for instance, it's limited to the top 5 players on the ground for distance, run or speed, or sprints, those things. So it doesn't give a full team sort of view, or at least not a full team view that's going to really help get a handle on the running power. And I think it's only on the AFL app. So if you go to the game, you go to the match, and on the right-hand side of that top thing, you'll see tracker. And that's all based on the GPS data. It's the same GPS data that the clubs get. So it's interesting to look at. But, so for instance, last week against the Saints, Langdon had the most kilometres for the match. And for us, he ran 15.9 clicks in that game. That's a long way to be running every game. Collectively, the team ran 298 kilometres for the game, one more than the Saints, who ran 297 kilometres collectively. This week against Freo, Langdon again had the most kilometres, but ran 15.3 kilometres. So statistically not a huge amount less, but still, did less. But collectively, the team ran 286 kilometres, so 12 kilometres less than last week, which is statistically getting meaningful, and 5 kilometres less than Freo, who collectively ran 291 kilometres. 5 kilometres less across a team is statistically pretty significant. I've looked at these numbers for the last couple of seasons, and they're often bang on the same. So 5 kilometres is notable. Now, of course, they're really rubbery figures, and there's all sorts of factors that come into play. For example, the game style of the opposition, the conditions, a number of other things. So, like I'm not putting too much weight in that data, but as I say, it's the only data really that I can look at that's specific about, for instance, kilometres run and how many sprints we did, repeat sprints, defensive running. So it's well worth looking at. But just on the raw numbers, we ran 12 kilometres fewer than last week. We ran more kilometres than our opponents last week, and that this week the opposite is true. And our best runner in Langdon ran less distance this week, albeit only 600 metres than last week. In previous years, I've also used pressure, because it is difficult to find data that would support, how well a team is running, or otherwise, as the case may be. I've used pressure as a proxy for runners. There appears to, just from my observation, to be a correlation between flagging at the end of games and the pressure rating falling away. Often last year we were clearly running out of puff in the, in last quarters last year, particularly in the last 10 minutes of the last quarter. That was evident watching games, and it was also reflected almost invariably in the pressure rating caving in that last quarter. And it was certainly the case in this match, with our pressure rating in quarter one being 175, but a woeful 140 in the last quarter, to their 166 in that quarter. The 26 pressure rating points down in that last quarter. That's a differential of 35 between our best quarter one, and our last quarter for 140 is huge. That's massive. And the other pattern for all teams is often that teams' highest pressure ratings are in the first and third quarters, which makes sense because obviously they're at their freshest at the beginning of the game in the first quarter, and then again after halftime, after they get the opportunity to have a break at halftime. It was certainly the case for us. We had our pressure rating in the first quarter was 175 and 167 in the second quarter. Our pressure rating in the third quarter was equal high, 175, and then, as I said, dropped dramatically away to 140 in the last quarter. Theirs was similar, but their most pressure was in that first quarter, 174. Interestingly, one less than us, so our pressure was better than theirs in that quarter, which surprised me when I saw the data. And theirs fell away to 169 in the second quarter. They had 161 in the third quarter, and actually increased their pressure by 166 in the quarter. Notable, in that third quarter, we had 14 more pressure points than them in that quarter, so 175 to 161. But given the paucity of reliable data that points to running power and how well we might be covering the ground, it's certainly one area that you have to trust the eyes to a large extent. And as I said, it was evident. You could watch it live last year how we were struggling to run out games. But as we go through the show, as I'll talk to through the show, there are plenty of data points that evidence we simply, for whatever reason, whether we just weren't running hard enough or didn't want to, we simply didn't run hard or far enough. For example, the damage they did on turnover and their efficiency once inside their 50 was definitely correlated to our not putting on pressure and not covering off that handball receive. As I said, they had 72 more handball receives than us. For me, that was the reason the number one reason. Obviously there are others, but the key reason I think we lost the game was we lacked run and didn't cover, didn't spread, didn't cover on offense and defense, but particularly defense. It must have been a terrible day to be a defender, particularly in that first quarter. 25 inside 50, the ball coming in quickly. The kicker who with that last kick inside 50, not putting pressure on them, being overlap with handball. And as I say, that's exactly the way we want to play. So, to me, that was the key factor. So the second one was equity points. So I won't. I know I went through this last week and also on the podcast. I'm going to do it one more time. I won't do it next week. The player ratings, I think, are an excellent source for looking at players' impact and performance. It's got some weaknesses, as I talked to last week. But the really short version, apologies for repeating myself if you've heard this before, the really short version of the definition for player ratings is that it's a measurement of the direct impact each player has on a game through their actions that affect either the ball or ball carrier, expressed as scoreboard impact, which is exactly why I like it so much as an assessment tool and an analytic tool, particularly in terms of comparing like-for-like players. I think it's really, really strong for that. To get the measurement in terms of those points, 3 factors are considered for each action a player has: the location of the ball on the ground before and after the action, the situation before and after the action, and the difference in next expected score value before and after each action. Actions that increase a player's team's chances of scoring next, example, taking possession, moving the ball forward, give positive ratings, and actions that decrease those chances in our case, the D's scoring, decrease those chances of scoring, example, turning it over, missing really, really easy shots at goal, missing a tackle, give negative ratings. The player rating each player gets at the end of a game is a sum of these ratings. And the 2 most significant categories of points players can earn in terms of where they get the majority of their points: ball winning, so points from winning possession of the ball, and ball use, how they use the ball, the points from disposal, including shots at goal, and obviously their field kicks and carrying the ball as well. Wheelo has created what is called an equity point model, and that's aggregating up all of the total team points. Adding up all of the player rating points into a single score. And now, as he noted, that just looking at who got the most points of each team is of little value, doesn't tell us anything, because the score tells us what we need to know in terms of the difference between the two sides, as it did on the weekend. And to be honest, that we were a bit lucky that they didn't take further advantage of their opportunities in that first quarter. They easily could have been 10 goals plus up after the end of that first quarter. Such was their dominance. But what you can do with the equity point model, and I think this is excellent, it can be sliced up into categories. For example, pre-clearance, post-clearance, ball winning, and ball use. And by aggregating the points each player gets or loses for those categories, for aggregating up across the whole team, you can get a whole team rating for each of those categories. I think that's excellent because it provides a much more nuanced, accurate method of analysing performance in those categories as it measures scoreboard impact, not just raw numbers. So, for example, our disposal efficiency was 68.8%. Theirs was 73.4%, which doesn't seem too bad. Less than a 5% differential in disposal efficiency, but that doesn't jibe with what we all saw and how poorly we used the ball and how well they used the ball, and how significant that was. Turnover points to that a little bit, so you can triangulate different things that help. But the equity points for ball use seems much more representative of how poor our ball use was and the difference between us and them. Our collective number of points across 23 players for ball use was only 26.9 total points. That's woeful. Conversely, they had 71.3 points, so much more impactful. So that means that they they had direct scoreboard impact. They smashed us for ball use, and as I say, the equity points I think gives a much better sense of that than just looking at disposal efficiency, which is not a particularly good measure. Kicking efficiency, similar. We even look better on kicking efficiency than disposal efficiency. Just quickly, so ball use. You get positive points, positive equity for actions that move the ball into a better scoring position or result in a goal. You lose points for turnovers, missed shots, or going backwards, for instance, kicking backwards, that decreases the team's immediate scoring probability. Ball winning equity measures the points added to a team's expected score, specifically from the act of winning a possession in dispute. Hard ball gets, loose ball gets, intercepts, etc., etc. So this week, the key standout was, as I said, in terms of those numbers, was ball use. They smashed us 26.9 collectively for our team to theirs, 71.3. To get a sense of where that stands sort of across the AFL. The AFL average so far this season for points, equity points for ball use was 52.9. So we're nigh on half the AFL average for ball use, and that's how it felt, and that's much more accurate, or feels more accurate for sure, is more accurate than disposal efficiency and kicking efficiency. Interestingly, ball winning was much closer, and I'm not so convinced this is a reflection. Actually, it was 118.9 to 119. AFL average is 111 points for winning the footy, aggregated up across a team. That is, our 2025 average was 112. So, pretty close to, or in fact better than last year. And it probably points to the issue of sort of over-indexing that first quarter and it colouring the whole game sort of analysis, because what that tells me is, we weren't winning the ball in the first quarter, but we did a much, much, much better job of doing so in the second, third and fourth quarters, much better. Just quickly with ball use, our 2025 average was 39.6 points for how we used the ball. We were terrible at kicking the ball last year, so 26.9 points is really a horror show in terms of ball use, and they will not be impressed at all amongst the coaching team with that number. And hopefully it improves this week. Just really quickly, post-clearance, they smashed us in this. They got 163 points, equity, 163.6 equity points for the points post-clearance, after what happens after the clearance. We only had 113. Now, sort of a context, the AFL average is 128, so they were amazingly effective post-clearance. And again, as contrast, in 25, our average was 115, so it wasn't miles under that, 113, but theirs was super, super impressive and was a big factor, I think, in the win. The three phases of football. So we're on to the next bit. The three phases of football, as I said, defence, offence and contest. As I noted, I was thinking about also including transition phase, but I think it will confuse. The transition is the change of possession and is it's that period between offence and defence. It's often considered increasingly considered the most critical phase in footy at the moment. There's two types of transition in that sense, in that definition. Offensive transition, moving from defence to offence immediately after winning a turnover. It often involves fast direct play to catch the opposition out of position. And defensive transition, moving from offence to defence immediately after losing the ball, which requires defensive hundreds or high intensity running to get back and cover opponents before they score, which is the area that I noted I think we really struggled on. It's where we lost the game, I think, in exactly that ability to cover the Frio's run and carry and transition. I'm not going to sort of cover that, I thought, because it's sort of confusing with the transition data that I'll speak to in offense. So, it's rolled up in that anyway, I guess. So offense. The offense phase occurs when a team has clear possession of the ball. The primary objectives are to maintain possession, transition the ball towards the attacking goal, obviously, and create scoring opportunities. And the key actions are effective, or they include effective kicking, handballing, moving the ball to find open teammates, creating leads, forwards moving into space to provide targets, and spreading the field to stretch the opposing defence, which they did super well to us. And as I noted, though, that we look like we're not going to be using much lateral ball movement. We're going to be moving the ball forward under King, but we spread the field that way to stretch the opposing defence to drag them outside of their D. Defence is the opponent has the ball. The defence phase begins as soon as the opposition gets possession or gains possession of the footy. The goal is to prevent the opponent from scoring, obviously, and to force a turnover, ideally. Key strategies include pressure and tackling, directly contesting the ball carrier to cause errors, all team defence, players working together to clog passing lanes and cover a dangerous space, which is, again, without sort of flogging a dead horse, what we really struggled to do, particularly in that first quarter. I think that was the key to the loss. Spoiling is another obvious key. Defence, there's others, but spoiling, defending punching the ball away, for instance, in aerial contests, but also 1%ers and all of those things. And then contests. So when the ball, often it's neutral at that stage. The third phase is contents. The contents phase occurs when neither team has clear possession. It's often referred to, like it's that hunt for the footy, I guess. It happens, the most obvious time that happens is at stoppages, centre bounces and around the ground stoppages and ball ups, or when the ball is loose, and that's where ground ball gets come in. Sort of key elements of that are, in terms of the contest of ball winning, winning the contest, using strength and technique to win, the hard ball, I guess. First use, gaining the initial disposal to set up the offensive phase, and screening, so teammates blocking for each other to allow one of their teammates to win the ball and give them a bit of time and space. And I thought Freo did that really well on the weekend, actually. The contest. So I'm going to start with defense, because as much as King wants us to be an attacking side, and, that's exciting, and it's not going to win us a flag unless we're top four. I'm not suggesting we're going to win a flag this year, but that's where we want to get to, obviously, as a club. That's where King wants to get to. He's clearly, I think he's come in and he's focused on becoming a more attacking side, which makes sense given the number of years under Goody, with being a defense first side and that philosophy. So it makes a lot of sense for him to be really focusing on the offense first, and the transition of the footy, which I'll roll up into the offensive part of the game. However, having said that, we'll need to sort our defence. It's going to be critical. So I'm going to begin each week looking at our defence and picking out some key numbers. Obviously not everything, but picking out some key numbers for this and all of the other categories that I think were key to help us understanding the end result and what the game looked like. We had 76 intercepts. They had 77. That's great. That's really good. The AFL average this year is 68.2 intercepts, so well above the AFL average. We averaged 64.8 intercepts last year, and that was a strength of ours under Goody, obviously. Not so much last year because of the change methodology, but we're averaging 64.5 in our 2 games this year, so above that average. That was really good. As I said, they had 77. I was surprised at that. I was really, really surprised at this number. And again, I think there's 2 ways of looking at this game. If you take out the first quarter, that's where we lost the game. And, as I said, their run and carry was a big factor of that. But if you look at the last 3 quarters, we matched them for a lot of the key stats, and in some instances were better than them. And this is 24 intercept marks. I was really surprised with that, which is one of the reasons I really like looking at the data and analysing the data post-game, because often stuff surprises me and I think, oh, okay, we either did more poorly than I thought in that area, or we did well, much better than I thought. And in a big loss like that, where we weren't going to win after that first quarter, it's really easy to see everything from that point on, through a negative lens, and sort of and think the whole game was terrible. They were a top 4 team who, I haven't looked, but would probably be top 2 or 3 for premiership favourites. So no shock that on their home deck they were going to be formidable. But yeah, 24 intercept marks is super impressive. AFL average is 14.1. We averaged 16.3 last year. We're averaging 18 so far this season. Impressive. We also had 55 tackles to their 45, so plus 10 for tackles. That shows great defensive intensity. Last week we only had 3 tackles inside 50, which was not great. This week we had 8, much better. They had 9, so only 1 more tackles inside 50. Another stat that actually really surprised me. This one was nuts. Not too bad. Like, we lost 33, so 33.3% of our defensive one-on-one loss I thought it could have been higher. It was high. So, we seemed to lose a lot of them again, particularly in that first quarter. The AFL average is 26. I was above that, but not wickedly so. And it's bang on. So that's what we lost last week. So we're 33.3% is our season average. So it was the same against the Saints. What's nuts is they didn't lose a single defensive one-on-one contest. So that is unbelievable. And I think that's probably pretty significant factor, obviously, in how hard we found marks inside 50 and scoring. And I think it was a big factor, obviously, a big factor in our relative inefficiency going forward, and also our poor retention rate inside 50. I'm putting territory inside defense because I think, you could probably put it in offense as well, but it sort of describes a little bit about how the ground's set up. For the match, it was 49-51. I think with this model, 50-50 is probably about, this is what I said last year because we were trying to implement a similar model. 50-50, I think, is what coaches would be looking for as their benchmark. So that's how it looked for the game. Sort of ended up being 52% in forward half, 48% in the defensive half of the ground. Just a reminder that that's defined literally by a line across the centre through the centre square through the centre circle. What really jumped out really was how the pattern. So it was 31% to 69%. So 31% in our forward half in the first quarter. They had it in their forward half 69% of the time. And that really, really sort of highlights that dominance that they had in the first quarter. But after that, in the second quarter, we were 59% in our forward half, 53% of the time in the third quarter, and 54% of the time adds up to 49%. So really, that first quarter was just diabolical, and things improved greatly after that. All right, jumping to the second phase of footy, offense. I talked about our disposal efficiency before, 68.8% to 73.4%, and kicking efficiency was 64%, 66. So really, our kicking efficiency wasn't nearly as poor. Again, risk of banging on, flogging a dead horse is that, to me, that doesn't really reflect how poorly we use the ball, and the equity points is a much better for ball use is a much better reflection of that. This was a key number, I thought, because we did really well with this last week. Kicking into forward 50 retention rate was 44.9% of the times we kicked inside 50, we retained it. They were 51.3. AFL average is 47.5% of times going in, the ball's retained. So, we weren't a million miles off AFL average, but we're well down on what we achieved against the Saints last week. We're averaging 55%, 55.8 for the season thus far across the two games. And again, by way of contrast, so 44.9% of the times we retained the ball inside 50. Last season, for the full season, the average was 46.2, so not a million miles off that. But it was certainly an area that they did better. 51% of the time, 51.3% of the time they retained it inside 50. Meters gained for kicks was really interesting, actually. This surprised me because, as I said, partly because they got more disposals. That helps explain that. But we are a territory team. In total distance, we had 5,798 meters gained by through kicks. They had 6,197. So, quite a bit more than us. 399 differential. That actually really surprised me. We averaged, in pointing to making my point really about us being a much more territory long kicking side this year than we were last year, which I think, as I said, will continue. It will surprise a lot of people. Just, I think there's that real risk of the Goodwin myths from last season. In 2025, we averaged 5,545 metres gained, so well up in this game. Our season average so far is 5,800. So, in across two games, small sample, yes, but where metres gained in total from kicks is almost 300 up already. AFL average is 5,760. Meters gained per kick, almost bang on the same, 26.1 to 27.7. Handball meters gained This was the one that was really jumped out. It was terrific last week, a big change. In 2025, we averaged 169.1 metres gained per handball. We're now averaging 228.6 across our two games. The AFL average this season is 241.2 metres gained per handball. We had 226 in this game, which was about the same as last week. And so just a bit under what we had last week. So, pretty positive from that perspective. But I think this was a key sort of like this really, in terms of symptoms, this was a pretty significant symptom. They had 331 metres gained by hand, which is totally bananas when you consider the AFL average is 241.2. 331 metres gained by hand is incredible. 110 of them, or I think it was 108, but let's say 110 for the sake of argument, were in the first quarter. And again, that just shows how they spifflicated us in the first quarter. So nearly a third of their metres gained by hand occurred in that first quarter. Incredible. 105 more metres gained they had than us. And it really, again, showed the way we want to play. That's exactly the model we want to play. They might be a little less direct than us. I think King, as I said, really wants to be direct, but very similar, what their game plan looks like now is very similar to what we want to achieve. And that forward handball, particularly in that first quarter, really helped springboard their overlap, that created space, and I think was the key reason they had so often had one-on-one inside 50 that exposed us, and obviously space inside 50 to hit up leading targets. I think that was a really key symptom, a key stat. Scores per inside 50 was another one. We only scored 35.7% of the time when we went inside 50. AFL average is 47.2. Last year, we averaged 45.1%, so shocking efficiency. Conversely, they scored 56.9% of the time when they went inside. That's again, as I said, AFL average is 47. That really is a really excellent demonstration of their dominance in that sense. Again, I would posit that that's all to do, a big factor, not all to do, is how well they move the ball and how poorly we did at slowing down their transition by spreading and running and covering the outlet player. Goals for inside 50 rate was even more striking in terms of the, in some respects, 17.9. We only scored a goal 17.9% of the time we went inside 50. They were 29.3% of the time when they went inside 50. They scored a goal. AFL average is 25% of the time this season. So they were above AFL average. We're well below AFL average. We lost the game. Just as a contrast, last year we averaged 22.3% of the time we ended 50. We scored a goal. So again, we were terrible king side last year. And we were terribly inefficient. Everyone talked about it all season. We were even more inefficient in this game, only 17.9% of the time we scored. This surprised me as well, really surprised me. Marks inside 50, which can be a really good data point around, is a really good indicator of, generally, a good indicator of ball movement, because like last week, we had more marks inside 50 than this week, but it's because, when you hit lead up forward targets because there's space, that's a function of moving the ball quickly and transitioning effectively and getting those overlap run and handball chains really working effectively. That's what pumps up your marks inside 50. We both had 12. Freo had 12. The D's had 12. I was super surprised at that. We averaged 10.9 marks inside 50 last year. The AFL average this season so far is 11.6, so above AFL average. That's a really positive stat. So that I wouldn't have thought that at all if I'd been asked to guess how many marks inside 50. That's, and again, I think you can look at this, if that's pretty much 12 across the last three quarters. We were so sort of so smashed in that first quarter. A lot of the positive stats really demonstrate how well we did in the last three quarters. So we'll get to transition. This is in the offense, and it's a bit why I sort of didn't have a separate category for it. But transition stats measure how often possession chains result in a score or an inside 50. Chains include all kicking chains, all clearances, and intercepts with at least one disposal in the chain. Chain to score percentage is a proportion of all chains that result in a score. Defensive 50 to forward 50 percentage is proportion of all chains starting in the defensive 50 that resulted in an inside 50. 50. Defensive 50 to scoring percentage is the proportion of all chains starting in the defensive 50 that resulted in a score. Defensive half to forward 50%, forward 50 percentage is a proportion of all chains starting in the defensive half that resulted in inside 50. And lastly, defensive half to score percentage, proportion of all chains starting in the defensive half that resulted in a score. This another stat that demonstrated how much better they were at transitioning the ball, and they're linking up by hand and by foot, moving the ball from our back half. We 16.7% of the time, our possession chains, that's all of them together, we scored. They were 28% of the time, so in their scoring chains, which is well above AFL average of 22.7. We were averaging 21.5% for that stat last year. So it really indicates how poorly we did in terms of our possession chains, disposal chains, resulting in a score. The other one that jumped out at me was defensive half to score percentage. So from our back half, defensive half, we scored 15.3% of the time with those chains. They scored 19.7% of the chain of the time. AFL average is 13.9 this season percent of the time, moving the ball from the back half through chains, resulting in scores. So we were above AFL average. They were way above AFL average. So that's a pretty good stat for us. We are averaging 17.2% defensive half chains to score percentage this season. So that's also well above average. So that would be looked at by the coaching team as really a very positive number. Expected scores very similar to last week in the sense that both teams scores were almost bang on the expected score. So neither team can really complain from that perspective about the score not reflecting performance. The expected score was 70.2 for us. We scored 70. The expected score for Freo was excuse me, was 113.4, and they scored 118. So almost bang on. Score sources was fascinating. We scored 19 points from kick-ins, which again we scored 3 goals. That's a good indicator of moving the ball effectively from the back half. I think the really big one though, so that's great. We've only conceded. They scored 8, so we scored 11 more points from kick-ins. That's a really low. That's well above AFL average, and we're giving up 7 so far. So we've given up 15 so far. But the big number for me that was in terms of score was centre bounce. We didn't score a point from centre bounce. That was just woeful. They only scored 7, so only 7 points. And last week I can't remember, but I think I remember noting that it was something only like 12 points collectively last week from the centre bounce. That's a really striking number. We scored nothing from our centre bounce clearances or directly from centre bounce. They scored 7. Really, that's a anomalous number, and I was shocked, actually, really surprised they only scored 7. What's notable about that in the previous 5 seasons before this year, we consistently ranked in the top 4 for scores from centre bounces. Everyone knows, that was our one wood winning clearances and stoppages around the ground. The last time we failed to score a point from centre square clearance was way back in round 13, 2024 versus the Pies of all teams. And before that, 2 years before that was round 19, 2022 versus the Bulldogs. Disastrous, really. But yeah, it was quite amazing that they only scored 7 points. Around the ground stoppages, we only scored 10. So we had 10 points from clearances, which is not great. It's pretty hard to gild the lily on that one. So they scored 29 points, 19 3 goals, touch over 3 goals more than us. We're averaging 29. Between Saints and Freo, averaging nearly 29.5 points, or 29.5 points, nearly 30 points. Our opponents are scoring from stoppages. This was so. You could argue the two big from symptoms, if you like, the two big sort of differentials in terms of score sources were 6 more points from stoppages. Actually, what am I talking about? So 23 more points from stoppages all up. That's 16 more from around the ground stoppages and 7 more points from centre bounces. And then this was a big one again. This really demonstrated the difference in the teams of how well we move the ball. We scored 41 points on turnover. We're averaging 55.5 so far. We scored 70 points last week, so nearly 30 points less on turnover than we scored last week. Complete inverse. They scored 74 points, so that's what, 33-point differential from turnover. You add that to the 16 points for the 23 points. You get a good sense of where they won the game just from their score sources. Both, particularly the turnover, really, that comes from doing a good job of defending our turnover, but we weren't running the ball. Again, I'll go back to we just weren't running and spreading, and we weren't defending turnover. They really cut us open. 33-point differential was massive. That's really the game right there. So in terms of where scoring starts, the chain starts in terms of scoring. Defensive 50, interestingly, 32 of our points came from our defensive 50, which again is the club would be really pleased with that, because it really demonstrates that we're getting our scores from the back half. They only scored 29 of their points, conversely, from the defensive 50. The other number was forward 50. We only scored, they scored 32 points from the defensive 50. We're averaging 29. So we're both equal for our scores from defensive 50, 32 each. The big one, though, that I jumped out at me from where scoring chains begun, was we only scored 9 points from inside our forward 50. Conversely, they scored 29 points, 20 more points than us, which is huge. And I think that sort of was why I was a bit surprised that we had as many tackles inside 50 as we did. Didn't correlate to us then creating scoring chains. But they were fantastic at putting pressure on inside 50 and creating scoring chains that began inside 50. 29 points is really high. In terms of one that I looked at often last year, points from defensive half is the first one was defensive 50. This is defensive half. Was 46 points from the defensive half, which is pretty good, and they were 49, so really almost sort of the same as them, and which is real positive given how well they move for the ball from their back half. And again, I would argue a big chunk of that was in the first quarter for them. So we really leveled up in the last three quarters, and I think it'd be easy to forget that. And so impressive performance from that perspective in the last three quarters. Yeah, they'd be happy with 46 points from the back half. 49 is our average so far across the two games. Finally, the third phase of footy contest. Contested possessions, they smashed us 124 to 143. Ground ball gets, they spifflicated us 82 to 101. No negative, sort of a 19 differential for both contested possessions and ground ball gets. Post clearance contested possessions, I was surprised actually. They had 9 more than us, but if you'd asked me to guess, I would have thought it was more than that. By way of contrast, it's interesting. We scored 90. We had 90 contested possessions in post-clearance contested possessions, I should say. The AFL average is 81.2, and in 25 we only averaged 82.7. So it was above our post-clearance contested possessions, was above both our season average, which is 82.5. And our average last year of 82.7 and the AFL average of 81.2. So I thought that was a really interesting number. And the other one that I was really surprised at from a contest point of view, again, I would have, if asked before, looking at the numbers, I would have got this wrong. We took 10 contested marks and they took 9. So we had one more contested mark than us. AFL average in the games played thus far is 8.2. So above AFL average for contested marks. Our 25 season average was 10.5, so a little bit under that. In terms, I spoke about the equity points at the top, but in terms of equity points as it relates to the contest, ball winning, is that we're all, this is what I was a bit surprised at, as I flagged, is despite being smashed for contested possessions and ground ball gets, our ball winning was almost on parity with theirs. 118.9 points to their 119.4. So a reminder that it's all of the time an individual player wins the footy, aggregated up across all 23 players. When you add all of those points up, you get 118.9 for us, and they only had slightly more, 119.4. The AFL average is 111.8, so both of teams were above the AFL average for ball winning. Our average in 25 was 112, so again above that. We were a contested side. We had Oliver last year, we had Petrarca last year, so our ball winning equity points for this game was actually higher than our average last season, which I think would surprise a lot of people. It certainly did me, and it doesn't. There seems to be a bit of it. It surprised me because of the differential in the contested possessions and the ground ball gets. We had 19 down for both of those stats. But it really sort of emphasises my point about equity points, talk about impact. So if you just look at the raw numbers, you win a contested possession, that's great. But if you then turn the ball over from that contested possession, then that's where you lose. That's where you lose. The raw number of the contested possessions doesn't say what you did with the ball, if that makes sense. So it's one of the reasons I like the equity points, because it gives meat on the bones of those contested numbers in this case, and disposal efficiency and kicking efficiency in the ball winning, in regards to ball winning equity points. So, when we won the ball, we were obviously pretty impactful with it, which is excellent. I think it points a little bit to the way King wants us to play, which is maybe fewer disposals but higher impact, fewer contested possessions but higher impact when you do win them, and of course, obviously, a focus on positive ball use or good ball use, which wasn't the case this week. Would be the most disappointing of all of the numbers, I suspect, for the coaching staff. Total clearances were 30 to 33. They had 3 more than us. Centre clearances 15 to 12. We were +3, but as I mentioned before, we didn't score a single bloody point from that. That is awful. AFL average this season, centre clearances 13.7, so we're above average for the number of centre clearances we won. They were below AFL average. We won more centre clearances, believe it or not, than our 25 average, which is 12.8, yet didn't convert. I didn't even score from it. That is that's terrible. There's no other way of looking at that and not going, oh my God. So stoppage clearances, in raw numbers, we had 15, they had 21. We're down 6 for stoppage clearances. This one was really interesting. I thought first possessions, they smashed us for winning the ball at clearances, for getting the first possession at clearance, 27 to 43. So we were down 16, to give a sense of how that looks at an AFL level. AFL average for first possessions is 38.6. So they were above AFL average. We're well below AFL average. For that stat, we actually were amazing last year. We were 42.3%. So we're way, way below that. So they were getting first possessions at clearances. I guess that jibes with, that marries up with their winning the contested footy and, how much better they were in that space than us. But the key number that I thought was really interesting was, after winning that first possession to clearance percentage. So after winning possession, actually getting the clearance, 77.8% of the time we turned a first possession to clearance, and they were only 67.4. So we got first possession less often, but we turned it into a clearance more often than them. AFL average is 75.3 this season. We're above that, 77.8% of the time we turned that first possession into a clearance, which is a real positive, and particularly given the sort of challenges we had and the number of players we had rolling through and playing on ball. So sort of skipping through to just really quickly, our centre bounce attendances, excluding our rucks, Maxi, who were our 3 players who were in the centre at rucks were Maxi, obviously, he had 25 centre bounce attendances, Pets and Roo. Pets had, what do you have? He had, Roo had 2 and Petty had 3. We had 11 players with centre bounce, so excluding the rucks, we had 11 players go through the centre bounce attendances, up from 9 last week. I noted last week 9 is high, 11 is crazy high, and I think it really reflects, as I said last week, King's approach to having a sort of core midfielders, which are Steele. Well, this week it was Steele with 24 centre bounce attendances, Colt with 19, but I think that is to do with his in tagging Sarong this week and Nass last week. Caleb Windsor 16, Cozzy 12, and Tom Sparrow. It looks like they're the core players, and then sort of supported by a fleet of other players who can roll through the middle and will roll through the middle. So Trent Rivers had 3 centre bounce attendances. Jai Cully had 3, and I flagged that last week that I wouldn't be surprised to see him go into the centre as well, and he did this week. And really surprisingly, to me at least, Kay Chandler had 3, Langford only had 1, and Latrell Pickett had 1. But that's there's 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 11 players, excluding the rucks, running, having a centre bounce attendance. I think that's a real sort of notable feature of how King has got to set up and what the midfield system is going to look like. Ruck contests, 57 ruck contests to Max and 9 to Roo, 6. Jai Cully was interesting. He had 6. Petty had 4. Brody Myercheck had 1. Obviously, that includes the around the ground rucking. I talked about team pressure at the beginning in terms of why I thought we lost, so I won't go into that, apart from just to note our top 5 pressure players for the game. And I still think, particularly pressure, it may not be as important at the moment as in terms of its impact on the probability of a team winning. But when the whips are cracking, as we get closer to the end of the season, and particularly as teams start fatiguing, it will, pressure and contest will remain critical things in footy. Jack Steele was our highest rated player in terms of pressure. He had 62 pressure points, 25 individual pressure acts. Cozzy next, 20 pressure acts, 51 pressure points. Excellent, I think, in terms of him being switched on and being invested. Tommy Sparrow criticised pretty extensively on Demon Land, probably with some justification. A lot of that to do with he doesn't have any hurt factor, but this is, he is a role player, and this is, he's is applying pressure. 18 pressure acts, 49 pressure points. Caleb Windsor, who had not an average game, and he also had that shoulder stinger, which I thought was going to knock him out. He was 4, 20 pressure acts, 46 pressure points. Jai Cully, 18 pressure acts, 40 pressure points. Rounding out the top 5, 15 pressure acts for Xavier Lindsay for 38 pressure points. Right down the bottom is Bailey Fritsch had a grand total of 4 pressure acts and 6 pressure points, and Jacob Van Rooyen had 3 pressure acts. So that's really probably not good enough for 2 of our forwards. And Brody Myercheck only had 2 pressure acts. So between our key forwards, Roo, Fritter, and Brody Myercheck, what's that, 4, 7, 9 pressure acts between them. That's really not going to get the job done. They need to, particularly if they're not scoring goals, they need to be providing a lot more pressure than that, I reckon. So that's it. Just as a wrap up, I talked about this on the pod. I'm not going to go into it. I don't have time tonight to sort of preview the Carlton game. But as I noted on the main pod, for me, this is really a really good sort of, in simple terms, this is a game between our ball use and their ball winning. They had number 1 in the AFL for contested possessions, and for right up there, I think either 1 or 2 for ball winning equity. But they are on the bottom of the ladder last, which is incredible disparity, to be honest. We're about mid-table for ball winning, and we're a little bit higher for how we use the ball, which is a positive. They are, I think, number 1 or 2 for ball winning equity, which, as I said, measures the points collectively from winning a possession in dispute. But they're dead last for how they use the ball, for their ball use equity. And for me, that's the game right there. In terms of a preview, is that if we can, do a good job of matching them with, they'll win the ball use equity. They'll probably beat us for contested possessions, and they'll probably beat us from scores from stoppages. They really meat potatoes. They might want to. They don't look like they're going to be trying to implement a fast game plan, but I think that's a bit about the cattle they've got. They just, a bit like us last season, they really, really lack genuine leg speed. as I've talked about, leaving aside the cultural conversation about track and all of that stuff and Clas, it's bottom line, and Steve Mays, this is true of as well, bottom line, all three players are slow, and so you just need leg speed is become so important in footy, and particularly in the first third of the season. They are dead slow. For me, the game will come down to how well we negate or mitigate their advantage that they'll have at stoppages, and in terms of how they win the footy. So how well we can negate that, and how well we can exploit our advantage in terms of how we move the ball, how we transition the ball, and how we use the ball. So for me, critical will be our capacity to score from turnover. The 70% of score now is from turnover. We won it. We won against the Saints, you could argue, because the biggest symptom of that was that we had 20 odd more points than them on turnover. It was conversely the opposite was true in this game. So for me, the critical thing is how well we transition the ball, how well we run and spread to cover their transition, negate their ball winning ability, negate their stoppage, scores from stoppage, move the ball quickly from the back half, look to be aggressive. I'm really confident about this game. We're actually going into this game remarkably as favourites. Well, I don't think it's remarkable, but it just seems it probably says something about where the Blues are at. But we're favourites to win this game. The weather's going to be good. A perfect day for footy. I've got a feeling they might have set themselves for this game. We've got an 8-day break into it. I could really see us running them, and I think we'll look to do that. I think we'll look to run them into the ground and really look to exploit their lack of leg speed. I'm super confident for this game, and I'm thinking a 4-goal plus win. We'll see how it pans out, and we'll look at all of the numbers that demonstrate why we won next Tuesday. Hopefully I'll get it out next week, and we will, as I say, we'll look at how the game progressed from a statistical perspective next week. Thanks for listening. I hope you all have a good week. Enjoy going to the footy on Sunday. Get there, support the boys, and let's get a win.
That was Binman with the stats files, clocking in at 1 hour and 4 minutes, almost as long as the regular pod. A big thank you to Binman for putting that together for all of us stats nerds. If you've enjoyed what you heard, do us and Binman a favour by leaving a 5-star review and a comment on Apple Podcasts. We really appreciate the support, and if you leave us a review, we'll give you a shout out and read it out on the show. Both the main podcast and Binman Stats Files will be back next week to break down the match against the Blues. The main podcast goes live on Monday night, so join us live at demonland.com from 8 p.m. Binman Stats Files will then drop on Tuesday or Wednesday. See you next week, and go Demons!
Go Red Leggers!
It's a grand old flag, it's a high-flying flag. It's an emblem for me and for you. Well, it's the emblem of the team we love, the team of the red and the blue. Well, every heart beats true for the red and the blue as we sing a song for you. Should old acquaintance be forgot, keep your eye on the red and the blue. Where the team played fine in the year 39, we're the team that no one can lick. And you'll find us there after the final bell with the spirit of 1926. Well, every heart beats true for the red and the blue as we sing this song to you. Should old acquaintance be forgot,